Hey guys, my name is Nick and welcome back to the channel, and apologies for not having a video last week. The temperature was insane in the UK. Sitting in my man cave, my hobby studio, it was like 29 degrees at 10 PM. It was just impossible to either paint or record. So without further ado, we're going to be talking about today's video. And what we're going to be talking about is some of the new changes that have been revealed on Warhammer Community that specifically affect the beloved Thousand Suns. So let's get straight into the video. The first thing then I want to talk about is some of the weapon changes, and specifically the weapons that affect Thousand Suns. So I'm not going to cover every single one because we don't have every weapon available to us, like the Heavy Bolter for example. But we've been told categorically that in the new 9th edition codexes which are coming, I think we've got the Space Marine and the Necron ones due just in about a month's time, maybe a little bit less. And that's given us a clue on the community page about what weapons will affect Thousand Suns. And we're going to start with the Flamer here. All Flamer weapons, which are currently only a really low range of 8 inches, are going to be buffed to 12 inches. The big important piece here is with regard to a deep strike, and it also means that all ranges for any charging units, you're probably going to be in range for one of those overwatches, but that will cost you a stratagem, as we now know. But the big point here for Scarab Occult Terminators specifically is when you used to deep strike them, they were out of range of any target to use a flamer, or the heavy warp flamer. Now that it's 12 inches, that weapon now becomes slightly more viable again. Typically, as you've seen in some of the builds I do, it's a Soul Reaper cannon because it's always going to be in range. Now that flamer option is going to be viable. Does that mean I'm going to go out and buy another bunch of scarabs and build some more warp flamer options? Probably not at this stage. But for those that are just coming into the Thousand Suns remit and looking at that as their faction, it is something worth considering, just depending on what type of opponent that you might regularly play. Personally, I think the Soul Reaper is probably slightly better still than the randomness of the Flamer weapon, just because that is still a D6 number of shots and isn't gaining the new blast rule. Now, of course, every Rubric Marine can also take a Warp Flamer in their units as a replacement to their bolt gun option. They are pretty spenny on the old points, but adding 12 inches to a flame weapon, especially for a fairly slow moving unit, perhaps loaded into a Rhino or something else these days, is probably something to really reconsider once again. I've still got about 40 of my rubrics that I've got fully painted up. I've got about 6 with Warp Flamers, just for that flexibility and playing around with points and so on. I'm going to certainly give those a go with these new ranges once they drop into our codex, and just to see what the effect of that looks like. Whilst we're on the subject of Scarab Occult Terminators, they also receive another buff, and that is with the +1 strength to power weapons that is going to be hitting our forces. At the moment, our Scarab Occult Terminators, instead of coming with power fists or storm shields and thunder hammers like the Imperial ones get, we get those power weapons and the combi bolters. With a lot of power weapons, we do put out a lot of hits, but they are still only at strength 4. Going to strength 5 will make them much, much better when it comes to getting into that inevitable combat with them. Next up then is the change to plasma weaponry. Now, we don't have a huge amount of plasma options, but I do want to include it just as a completeness. We do have some plasma pistol options with some of our sorcerers, so they would be impacted by this if you upgrade those weapons on them. The ectoplasma on the Forge Fiend doesn't count because it doesn't have the same overheat rule. But what we're seeing here is that you don't overheat unless you roll a unmodified 1 to hit. So if you are being modified by a -1 by something that can fly, for example, or certain cover conditions that we have with our terrain traits, we're not going to overheat on a 1 and a 2. It is just a pure natural 1 now. Melter weapons, on the other hand, we do have several options to take these, mostly with combi melters on some of our vehicle upgrades, but equally when it comes to the multi-melter, we do have that option on a Hellbrute. So the changes here then is with the damage profile when they are in close range. Instead of being 2d6, pick the highest as it has been in previous editions for a couple of editions now. It is now d6 plus 2 damage. So we've got plenty of those weapons scattered around our codex. On the whole, you don't see that many, I don't believe, in a typical Thousand Sons army. But now that these changes are there, maybe a Hellbrute with that multi-melter could be a good fit. That gives us a maximum damage potential of D6 plus 2, so that gives us a damage of 8. And with a multi-melter with 2 shots now, we can actually pump out a potential 16 damage from a Hellbrute. That's quite nasty. So yeah, again, that could be a good fit for your anti-armor needs. Just for clarity though, even though Games Workshop were using their poster boys and the Imperium as all their weapon examples, they have clarified that no matter what faction uses that type of weapon, they will also get a similar buff. I'd imagine Fire Dragons, for example, will get a similar melter buff when their faction gets revisited to make them maybe a bit more punchier than an Eradicator, who seems to be much better. But we're going to get all of those kind of adjustments within the Thousand Sons Codex as well. Let's get to the meat of these changes then, and that is the power up exclamation mark. Every old school firstborn Marine is getting 2 wounds. Yeah, so you've got those languishing tactical Marines kicking around in a box, and you've gone all out for your Primaris because that's what's been sold to you, because they've got 2 wounds and they're cool. Everyone has 2 wounds. You, me, everyone. We've all got 2 wounds. Woo! Yeah, so this actually impacts our Thousand Sons. All our Rubric Marines are going to go to 2 wounds. All of our Scarab Occult Terminators are going to go to 3 wounds. 2 wound Rubric Marines, probably not as good as 2 wound Death Guard Marines, for example. But what are my thoughts on this? Now, I think the big interaction between Rubric Marines and 2 wounds is the type of weapon that would be used to shoot at them. Rubric Marines have a massive ability called All is Dust, which adds 1 to saving throws for Rubric Marines if the attack has a damage characteristic of 1. In addition, the -1 modifier to hit rolls for moving and shooting with a heavy weapon does not apply. So the big piece for 2 wounds is adding 1 to the saving throw with a 1 damage weapon. Now, if you were an opponent shooting at a Rubric Marine, you would fire typically low grade 1 damage weapons at them because they've only got a wound, and once they fail that wound, they're out of the picture, and they're quite expensive for what they are. Although the repointing adjustments that have just come out are not terrible, let's be honest. Now, if we go to 2 wounds and we have a points hike, we're looking at potentially a 20% points hike if regular tactical Marines are anything to go by, which will take us up to the sort of 20, 21, 22 point mark per rubric. Are we going to be shot at by damage 1 weapons anymore, knowing that we have now 2 wounds with a potential 2+ save because of the All is Dust rule, and then still have the abilities to shrug that off, plus the invulnerable save of 5+ as well? Are we now more likely to be shot at with high volume 2 damage weapons that will go straight through and will kill a single Marine every time? Now, of course, there is a big what if the new Thousand Sons Codex rewrites that and says that damage 1 and damage 2 weapons are impacted by All is Dust. We don't know that just yet. I know there's been a lot of chatter on the forums and communities and so on saying All is Dust is now going to be overpowered by being shot at by damage 2 weapons, like the increase to heavy bolter damage and so on, which you might have fired at a different target, but now they are damage 2. You know, your rubrics are now going to be prime target for those. Are we now going to be taxed for having 2 wounds or not? My personal opinion is I think it's a great idea. I think 2 wounds on rubrics does really make them that much more resilient. We already have the 5+ invulnerable save. You start putting them in cover. You can start really buffing them with other psychic powers, mainly because the smite ability, which is going to be another thing I want to talk about in a different video, has been slightly downgraded or slightly nerfed, rebalanced, however you want to pitch it. 2 wounds, and how many 2 damage weapons or variable damage weapons are out there? People are going to be shooting at your troops more than your other more fragile vehicles, for example. It's a real difficult balance. A lot of 9th edition is about board control. Objective secured troops are going to be very important. And that's where our rubrics really excel, is being resilient, tough guys, stood on objectives. And now they go to 2 wounds. they're probably going to be shot at by more variable damage weapons. As soon as that's a variable damage weapon, it overrules all his dust. So a D3 damage weapon that only does 1 damage ignores all his dust. But I still think it's a good thing. I still think with the right play, the right terrain traits that you're using, and the positioning of your Rubric Marines, you know where the enemy weapons are. You know potentially how to try and be avoiding those, so that they're going to be firing some more chaff-like weapons at you, so you're still going to get those special rules. Depending on the points, and depending on some of the other changes that we may see in the Thousand Sons Codex later in the release schedule, we don't know when that is yet. Obviously, I'll be covering that as soon as we get any teasers on the Thousand Sons Codex. I still think it's not a bad thing. I know there's a lot of people out there that have mixed opinions on this, but subject to how many points they go up by, and if we are talking 20% for that extra wound, it's probably okay. It does mean you are going to be quite rubric reliant because you're going to be making those investments. 3 wounds on the Scarab Occult Terminators, though, I think are a much better force multiplier. I think the additional strength on those guys, the Flamer option that is now a bit more viable, and their flexibility on the battlefield to control some of those secondary objectives and so on. And I do want to do another video on some of the scoring and some of the better options for secondaries with Thousand Sons, so stay tuned for that. I think the 3 wounds on the Scarab Occult is a much bigger winner than 2 on the Rubrics, but I don't think either really lose out. So those are my thoughts, those are my opinions, as usual, I'd love to hear from you in the comments section below. What are your thoughts on 2 wound Rubrics? Are we better off than Death Guard? I don't think so. That 5+ feel no pain on 2 lots of damage on a Rubric, on a Death Guard is just insanely good. Let's see if their points reflect that. But on Rubrics and Scarab Occult Terminators, I think this is probably going to be good news for us. As usual, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something new. If you did, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. And I shall catch you guys on the next video.